Hi guys, so today we're gonna look at the ventricular system in the brain. So just a heads up on what the ventricular system is. The ventricular system is the system that actually helps to produce cerebrospinal fluid to surround your whole brain and protect your brain as well. So let's get into the cerebral. So the ventricular system consists of the lateral ventricles. Now you have two of them, so they are actually C-shaped chambers located in each cerebral hemisphere. They are one of the largest ventricles, okay, and they are located right below the corpus callosum. So you can see the ventricles. They kind of look like a C-shaped chamber or a C-shaped ventricle located in each cerebral hemisphere. So you have two of them. You got a right one and you got a left one. So you also have a third ventricle located just below the corpus callosum itself, and it's in the midline, like in between the brains, okay, narrow space between the lateral and medial diencephalon itself. So it's in between the lateral and the not lateral and medial, I mean the right and left diencephalon itself. So that is your third ventricle. Now you also have your fourth ventricle located below or located between the pons and the medulla and the cerebellum itself. So you can see how the fourth ventricle is located just, I would say, close to the brainstem itself, where you can see the cerebellum itself, the pons, and the medulla oblongata itself. So that's the fourth ventricle. Now, talking about producing of cerebrospinal fluid, right? You remember how we have those C-shaped chambers, those ventricles, right? Those lateral ventricles. They have a structure inside called the choroid plexus. Now, the choroid plexus is a structure in there that actually produces cerebrospinal fluid, and it's located in each ventricle. So every one of those ventricles, we're talking about like the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle, they all have those choroid plexus which produces cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this is how the cerebrospinal fluid flows down. So the lateral ventricles actually produces cerebrospinal fluid, and those cerebrospinal fluid will flow down into the interventricular foramen. So it's kind of like a gap in between the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle itself, separating it. So the cerebrospinal fluid flows down into the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. Now, the third ventricle also has the choroid plexus, which produces cerebrospinal fluid. And those cerebrospinal fluid end up in the third ventricle and they go down into the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle itself. Now, after it's reached the fourth ventricle, right? The fourth ventricle actually has the medial and lateral apertures. Now, these medial and lateral apertures, they actually allow the cerebrospinal fluid to flow all around the subharbonoid space, the subharbonoid space, all around the brain and the spinal cord itself. And what happens is that those cerebrospinal fluids will actually makes its way up the submacroid space into these things. So you can see these pouches where I've actually drawn the arrows. Those are actually called the arachnoid glenations. Okay, so these are called the arachnoid glenations. So this is a now an example of how it will actually look like. So you can see the cerebrospinal fluid marked in blue down here. This is basically the subharbonoid space, and it's flowing down, and going up into the arachnoid glenations, which basically acts as a filter point, filtering the cerebrospinal fluid into the superior sagittal sinus, where they will go all around the brain as well. So this is the process. Like I said again, cerebrospinal fluid flows down into the subharbonoid space, okay, and flow up the arachnoid glenations, which acts as a filtration point, filtering the cerebrospinal fluid into the superior sagittal sinus to the rest of the bloodstream itself. Now, This is a little fun fact. So cerebrospinal fluid, right, in the volume itself. So every 8 hours, the cerebrospinal fluid is replaced, and I would say about maybe every 8 hours we actually produce about 150 milliliters of cerebrospinal fluid a day. And if we add up the entire day itself, we will actually form about 500 milligrams of cerebral spinal fluid. Now, why do we need cerebral spinal fluid? Well, it's pretty simple. Well, cerebral spinal fluid, right? They actually give buoyancy to the brain itself. So they kind of make the brain kind of squishy itself, kind of little jellies, if you know what I mean. Okay. So those cerebral spinal fluids, right, actually reduces the weight of the brain by 95%, or maybe a bit more or a bit less, but it's around that benchmark there. And this happens so it actually prevents the brain from compressing itself, and the cerebrospinal fluid also acts as like a protection of the brain. So I give you this example. For example, if you were to place ice inside of a glass, right, and you don't fill up with water, you shake it really hard. So pretend that the ice is actually your brain itself, and you shake it really hard. There's no buoyancy to the brain itself, so the ice is gonna break, right? Take another cup and fill it with the water that acts as the cerebral spinal fluid, and the ice acts as your brain. Shake that cup and you will tell the difference that the ice wasn't actually as damaged compared to the ice without water. So that's the good example with cerebral spinal fluid. Without cerebral spinal fluid, the brain won't give buoyancy, and it won't, protect your brain and give cushioning to your brain, and overall it will put a lot of compression on your brain, causing you to have lots of problems compared to where you have cerebral spinal fluid, the water example, for example, right? And you kind of shake it and the ice isn't as damaged as before. So this is why you actually need cerebral spinal fluid. So I'm going to take you through the entire system again, just a recap. So the lateral ventricles are actually at the top down here, and they have these things called the coronoid plexus. And those coronoid plexus will produce cerebral spinal fluid, which flows down into the interventricular foramen, into the third ventricle, which also has the choroid plexus, which also produces cerebral spinal fluid. Those cerebral spinal fluid will eventually flow down the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, which also has the choroid plexus, which produces cerebral spinal fluid too. And the fourth ventricle has the medial and lateral aperture, allowing the cerebral spinal fluid to flow all around the subgabernoid space. And those cerebral spinal fluid will eventually flow up all the way into the arachnoid glandulations, which acts as a filtration point, filtering the cerebral spinal fluid into the superior sagittal sinus, returning back to the bloodstream. And that, my friends, is the entire ventricular system of the brain. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.